Hello, my name is Ian. As ever, today, this week, in Introduction to Folklore, we're talking about religious folklore, which brings up a couple of immediate complicating questions. Because one of the things that we ask when we start to consider when we consider religious folklore is, well, what is the folklorist bringing to it? What is the folklorist doing? Because typically, when we talk about religious practice, we would be thinking of perhaps something that takes place in a religious studies classroom, or perhaps an anthropology classroom, or sociology, or a theology classroom for that matter. So, what is it that a folklorist does when they're studying people doing religion? They're not really studying religion, they're studying the people who are practicing it, because they're studying religious folk groups and hence religious folklore. One of the things that we go back to our basic definitions of groups, two or more people who share at least one thing in common, religious folk groups definitionally and usually self-professedly identify themselves as sharing in common with other people this participation in this group, this adherence to, and fundamentally belief in a narrative, an explanatory narrative that connects them somehow to, for lack of a better word, the supernatural. That in as much as they comprise a group with a long-standing tradition of practices and habits and ways of being responsible to each other and aesthetics and all the things that comprise a group, an incredibly important element is that some of that has been actually dictated to them how to be by some kind of foundational, extraordinary intervention into human history. So this is who you are. This is how you ought to be, and it's often that story becomes integral to the group, but that's still a matter of some interpretation. So what the folklorist does is looks at the religious practices of a group, not a group as vast as Christians or Muslims or a Baha'i or a group that large, but rather how that sense of belonging to a larger community with an extant history becomes manifested in small group activities within sort of a small localized group. Because we might have things like particular rituals that are fundamentally religious edicts, that this is something that you do. This is something that everyone around the world who identifies themselves as having this, participating in this group, does at this particular time. And what's more, there might be a particular script that is followed, a way of doing this. And like, cool. And you can look at that, and you can understand that, and explore that, and see that as it's like a transcript, a thin transcript on how to figure out on how to perform this. And then you bring it into the local community, and you have how that becomes actually manifested, how that is played out in what, and what's more, with the benefit of sort of, that precise ethnography, how that might be played out one particular community in one particular year, and all the circumstances that lead into it. So because even we as we go back to, again, two or more people who share one thing in common, the idea that we belong to multiple groups. It's like, cool, you belong to this religious tradition, excellent, awesome, go for it. How do your other things, other ways of being in the world, influence that? And so we the folklore, sort of what they bring to it is that dynamism of, okay, we have these things that it's okay that you understand them to be fundamental and foundational and the product of, for lack of a better word, revelation, but how do you work them? And how do you work them at this moment, at this time? How do you bring them into being? So we see them as performances. We see them as an informing worldview for because if I only say we see them as performances, then we're only going to be focusing on things like ritual, which is obviously a major part of it. And I'll get to ritual in a second. But if we also see like how you go in the world, the sort of shared repertoire, the shared worldview, how, what are religious jokes, not jokes about religion, but jokes that religious people tell that implies or typically requires some kind of shared understanding of these narratives that aren't necessarily located in place, but are located within this large faith community. So because they're located in narrative, we want to go back to some of our sort of foundational things. We'll be talking about this when we talk about folk literature. But folklorists tend to look, what we will sometimes call the major genres. It's an outdated term, but it's still a useful term. So I'll just sort of bring it up for a moment. The major genres of folk narrative. And we will talk about myth, legend, and tale, or Märchen. And tale are stories. They are understood as stories. They are understood as fictions. So they are not purporting to tell some kind of record of some actual happening. They might contain many sort of cultural truths, and folklore. One of the things that folklorists are interested in when they're studying tale is, well, what are the elements of worldview that shape this tale, and conversely, how does this tale then shape elements of worldview? So how is masculinity and femininity defined in the Brothers Grimm corpus, for example? But folklorists aren't saying, well, was there a Hansel and a Gretel? Was there someone abducting children? That's, to peel up that layer is to miss the point. But to see, okay, why is this tale continuing to have resonance time and time again? Why is it still vital? Why is it still communicated? That is the thread. Legend is narratives that are sort of on the cusp of believability. They don't sound, when they're, at least in their first flush, they do not sound particularly fictional because they are grounded in typically in real geography. This happened in this place. This happened in the town over there. And really, when we talk about legend and contemporary legend, we're talking about stuff that's happening now. And the stuff that's happening now is weird. It's like, I heard this thing. So really, legends don't even qualify as stories in as much as someone sitting down and telling a story, because they are arranged in the way that we tell stories, because they involve human actors, and then they involve a sequence of events that's put into some kind of logic. But when I'm telling you this, it's really because I think you need to know something, not sit a spell while I weave a yarn. Legends might subsequently become retold and seen as narratives, but they're always on this cusp of credibility. It's like, okay, even if you don't believe them, you go, well, no. But I see why people might fall for that, and then they become these opportunities for discussion. Myths are foundational stories. They are fundamentally, within the performance context, within the group, they're fundamentally understood and affirmed as true. Their extraordinariness is part of it. The fact that in order to believe them, you need to believe an almost unbelievable thing, an almost incredible, in that literal sense of, difficult to lend credence to, an almost incredible thing. And that commitment to the incredible, unbelievable story is basically the foundation. But because they deal with these extraordinary events at foundational moments that, had these things not happened, we would not be here. We would not be here, at least in the manner that we are here. So they have to be grasped as true. Religious narratives clearly fall under that rubric. Creation stories fall under that rubric, but we have political myths as well. We have national myths as well. We have the myth of colonialism, that, it's like, well, there's this empty North America that was just ripe for ours and destined for us to take. And that is a informing cultural myth. We are not saying it's true, but clearly it was believed for an awful long time with dire consequences. I talk about the myth of the Highland clearances, which was a historical reality, certainly, and you can attribute it, but when you think about how the story is told in the day-to-day, the story of the Scots the Highlanders being pushed out of their ancestral land, and then forced, briefly onto the Orkneys, and then or onto the outer islands, and then the Great Migration, and then finding Eastern Canada and settling here. There's a historical reality to that, but as it's told, it takes on that element of mythos, that extraordinariness, those extraordinary founding people who did extraordinary things, and therefore it becomes mythic. So myth shouldn't be understood as untrue, but there is this element of myth that has to be understood as uncontestable and within its context, and something that is that reaffirms the identity of the place. And really, to believe the myth is to be of the group. To not believe the myth is to not be of the group. So these communities are basically based upon, in part, not in full, but in part on their understanding of themselves, their understanding of concepts like justice, their understandings of concepts like morality, their understanding of concepts like what happens to us after we die, and what we owe each other, and all those sorts of things. Are the various, perhaps with the exception of what we owe each other, what happens to us after we die, probably basically a kind of a polis, a political understanding of the individual and their relationship to the collective. Also in this sense of continuity with the past, like all folk groups have, but that these informing principles did not arise through circumstance, through trial and error, in the way that other forms might, like material culture might have arisen from people trying certain things until a system works, and then lo and behold, this is how we define the house. But it doesn't have that. Well, the house, the literal physical reality of the house, that was not ordained by a divine being. That we don't have to follow this plan for a house or otherwise risk, whether you want to call it damnation, or risk a taint on our souls, or risk becoming ritually unclean, or these sorts of things, as opposed to different forms of behavior, different forms of morality that are suggested or imposed by these higher narratives. So one of the ways we see it, again, is through ritual, and it's good to sort of get a grasp on what ritual is. Where ritual is basically, there are many definitions for it, but if you think of it as this sort of enactment, this reenactment that we gather together frequently, and we usually at special times and special places, and we most rituals are basically reenactments of some kind of foundational narrative. So if you think of things like the ritual of the bris, the circumcision that takes place in Jewish communities, not that the Jewish communities are the only place where circumcision takes place, but in Judaism it is called the bris. It takes place 8 days after the child is born, and it is a ritual reenactment. The way it is done is a ritual reenactment of the circumcision of Abraham and Isaac. I guess technically the circumcision of Isaac, not necessarily the circumcision of Abraham, because he did it to himself, as the mark of the covenant, when he was told to sacrifice Isaac, and he did, and at the last minute, or he was going to, at the last minute, Yahweh intervened and said, no, you're never going to be sacrificing your children. You're going to be instead do this as a mark of fealty, basically. So hence the circumcision. And so it's a reenactment. It's a recommitment by reperforming a particular moment in the narrative. Similarly, in Christian tradition, the Eucharist, the giving of the sacraments, the partaking of the bread and the wine. And that resembles what happened at the Last Supper. And by doing so, by performing, we could talk about the Hajj as well. I'm using these examples that are reasonably common in North America, but this happens in Moon Festival as a ritual. It's not religious in the same kind of way, but it is dealing with sacred narratives, and so a reenactment of these narratives through performance, through embodied performance, that we get together and we do this sort of thing. But you have some. So you'll take something like the Eucharist as an example, and this is something. It's a rite. It's something that you need to do. It's dictated from the institutional religious authority, which is its own beast, and not necessarily something that the folklorist talks about as an institution, but often we'll talk about. First of all, we love hearing the jokes that priests tell, the jokes that rabbis tell each other, and we also have things like the tensions that might exist between institutional religious authorities and the folk. And there's a whole bunch of folk tales. Gerald Thomas, when he was doing his folk tales of Franco Newfoundland, and also others built on his work and did it in work on tales in Acadia and tales in Quebec. A lot of tales that juxtapose the priest and the clever boy, where the priest is always like this authoritarian figure, and the clever boy always outwits. And so that's a theme, that tension between institution and the folk is a theme. But you have the ritual that is dictated, and you do this. This is part of what the tradition and the people who have been given a certain authority over it by the institutionalization of religious practices. Not all religions have that, but nevertheless they are there. But how you actually enact the Eucharist is open to a certain amount of interpretation. What do you define as bread? What do you define as wine? How is it given? What are the social interactions before and after? And those are culturally based. Those are locally based. And because it's a ritual that you perform regularly, like every week, it is something that is particular to this place. So on one hand, that people, and it's important that within the religious community, it's important that that other people are doing this same thing at this same time. But it's also kind of cool that you are doing it at this particular way, in this particular way that is meaningful not simply to the broader international community, but to the people assembled here at this particular moment. So the idea is that as one does this, as I said, you're connected to the people who are similarly doing the similar thing at the similar time. But you're also, through this element of reenactment, you're also, through sort of transitive magical properties, you are going back to and being co-substantial with the original actors of that narrative. So as you go and do whatever particular ritual you are doing, Stations of the Cross, for example, you are, despite the fact that you are centuries away, and despite the fact that you are oceans away from some of these foundational narratives, by doing so you're almost magically transported in space and time back to that. That's sort of the premise. That's a working premise, and it's one of those things that you can be cynical about. But if you think that this might be an operative idea, then it starts to sort of gel a lot. Again, you don't have to believe that people are spatially transported, but I think it's a good thing to consider that people believe that they are spatially transported, not in some strange alien way. We're talking about metaphor, and we're talking about magic. So rituals, they typically take place at a sacred time, whether it's the cycle of the year, and it typically is the cycle of the year, or through rites of passage, where the group needs to gather together and reaffirm its groupness while simultaneously reaffirming its participation in this large foundational narrative. Furthermore, it typically takes place at a sacred place, either literally a sanctified place, like a house of worship, or conversely, when it takes place, that place is momentarily made sacred. You can think of things like this isn't 100% a religious ritual, although there is a very large room for discussion about whether it is or whether it isn't. But if you think of something like powwow, where powwow takes place in a field, and typically it is, I mean, it might be known as the place where the powwow happens because it happens regularly, but for the most part, it is a field. But during the time of powwow, it is laid out typically in a set of concentric circles with the most sacred space taking place in the middle, and then various decreases in sacrality until you get to sort of the profane space of where the vendors are and where the campgrounds are and tents and so on. But it's a series of kind of interlocking sacrality, but that field isn't necessarily sacred outside of powwow weekend. As I said, there's sort of gray fuzzy area because one of the issues of religious folklore as a discipline is still sort of defining these groups, and whether we're talking about groups that have very strict texts, or what is sort of what is religion if it doesn't have these texts, and all the sort of elements of this very 19th century. I will say colonial. I was just going to say like parochial, but since it has consequences, we might as well call it colonial, about what constitutes having a deeply set living religious tradition or not. And if you're going to define it by having a sort of a almost a bureaucratic professional class of arbiters of what constitutes faith and mediators between the individual and the divine, and you have a strict set of written texts and where it is text that is important, it is not orality that is important, then anywhere where you see a different kind of spirituality is going to be seen as something other, and therefore we just don't have the facilities to do it. We don't think that way, but there's still vestiges of that thought. So it's something to consider. Because one of the things that we have done is we sort of shifted away, folklorists have done, is we've, using the insights that we have gathered from the study of religion and the folk study of religion and so on, we use these same basic principles to talk about not religious belief, but belief. Where belief is about received traditions, and there's no problem with talking about received traditions, but received traditions that suggest how one should operate in the world. And so they can obviously have some kind of textual basis, or like the long-standing historical basis. New ones can emerge. So we can talk about new religious movements. They don't have to have the imprimatur of a large institution. So we can talk about new personal syncretic religious traditions and syncretism, where a whole bunch of things are brought forward. New religious movements, contemporary paganism, contemporary witchcraft that typically find elements from the past, and often find elements from the past of religious ideas that had also been systematically stomped out by sort of potentially oppressive, or not simply potentially, actively oppressive religious forces, and new meaning is found from there. And so there's a really rich study of witchcraft and so on. But we can also talk about belief that it does not necessarily have a connection with divine figures, but nevertheless present some kind of narrative about how we ought to be. So there's elements of veganism and elements of vegetarianism and certain elements of environmentalism that are, on one hand, I mean, they can legitimize themselves through science, and that's a fundamentally good thing. But they also legitimize themselves by basically having a creedal statement, or by referencing metaphors that are incredibly rich and incredibly symbolic. But I mean, they might not have. I mean, they are. One can be sympathetic to them, but they're really sort of just operative narratives, and so we can look at certain forms. I mean, many vegans and vegetarians are doing so for political reasons or health reasons and so on, but some are doing it as some kind of participation in a larger narrative of basically what constitutes the sacred and what constitutes the soul, which is a good reason for making decisions about what kind of thing one eats, and does one not engage in the eating of creatures. It's good to remember that we are, when we're talking about ritual, and we're talking about religious faith, and we're talking about these things, we're dealing in the element of magic. And once we say magic, we can be dismissive, and we can sort of be putting it in a corner, which is not my intent. But when folklorists and anthropologists talk about magic, basically they're talking about an overwhelming idea that seems to exist almost universally. And James Fraser was he was a late 19th, early 20th century armchair anthropologist / scholar of religion, and he wrote this book called The Golden Bough, which is sort of one of those incredibly influential and yet at the same time quickly dismissed as a piece of scholarship. But he came up with this idea, or this descriptor of the notion of sympathetic magic, where like acts upon like. And so things that in two different ways, sometimes they're in combination, but two different ways, things that have been in contact with someone or something continues to have connection to that someone or something. So we can clearly see that when we're talking about things like religious relics. We clearly think that when we talk about like geography, and that if a place has been trod on by important cultural figures, the ground itself retains something of that. So whenever you go to a place, like, I mean, tourism is this interesting aspect of participatory magic, because when you go to a place that is, that millions upon millions of people have been to, and millions, and at least dozens and dozens of incredibly important cultural figures have been to, there is something about that place, because you are bringing that sense of narrative, and you're bringing that sense of connection, and the sort of the almost, on one hand perhaps humility, but almost like, I am now connected to these people because I have been to this place. So whether we're talking about going to Graceland and where Elvis was, whether you're talking about going to the Parliament buildings, or whether you're talking about going to Notre Dame, whether you're talking about going to Mount Fuji, I mean, these become, because of the levels of accreted narrative attributed to certain landscapes, they become important cultural landscapes. And there's a sort of magical property because you are touching them. The other form of magic is homeopathic magic, where something has a connection to something if it resembles it. So we think about things like clearly religious iconography, and the fact that we might have a picture of a saint, or we might have use certain colors that are culturally that are related to our sacred narratives. That object tends to have some connection to it. So if you paint a picture, that's one of the reasons why there's a proscription against having images of the Prophet Muhammad, in that there's a kind of element of control that is suggested by the picture, and you do not control the prophet. And similarly, there's prescriptions against much religious illustration in Judaism as well. It's really sort of Christianity and their inheritances from Latin and Greek ways of being religious in the world, that we're going to depict, we're going to be showing images, and so it sort of takes on this different form. but and also through action, that by doing, again, that magical property, by doing this thing that resembles this thing, I am connected to this thing. And so ritual and magic are interrelated to each other. I am practicing something, and this practice is not simply the thing itself, but the thing itself in as much as it resembles what happened before. And then, as I said, we sometimes see the two in combination, in that we do these things not simply in the performative way, in an imitative way, but we also do it, we'll sometimes use objects that have been in touch with people. So, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the Pope touched this, it doesn't necessarily need to be someone sacred, but it could be something like, again, we're talking about folk religion, we're talking about folk religious belief and religious folklore. I do this thing, and I do it with my grandmother's bowls, or my aunt's tablecloth, or I do this with I'm wearing my late brother's sweater when I do it, and that the continuity and the continuity of objects is sometimes about the contact, not with the sacred former or the sacred figure in your sacred narrative, but with the community of believers and your personal community as well. And so, why do you do it this way? I do it this way because this was meaningful to my family 15 years ago. And that is just as valid as doing a thing in that particular way, as is I do it this way because the Bible tells me so. And so religious folklore is about this, the complexities of looking at how people operate with on the day-to-day, and sometimes in special occasions, and sometimes in their regular quotidian occasions, but how real people in real contexts operate in a way that, at the very least, they understand as being simultaneously participating in a much larger narrative, a much larger group, not simply of people, although that is part of it, but a much larger group of people that also includes the ongoing action, intervention, care of extraordinary supernatural or extraordinary beings, sometimes supernatural by however one wishes to define that, but the ongoing presence, felt presence of extraordinary beings. So religious folklore is a kind of fascinating area. And it's awkward. It's awkward because there are many people who, it's awkward to discuss because, at least in the 21st century, because it can sometimes be stigmatized. It's stigmatized in large part because we live in an age of scientificism. We live in an age that nothing that cannot be proven in a lab is worth discussing, which is incredibly annoying, at the very least. It is incredibly brutally disengaged in the human project. And yet, and again, the very thing, as I said earlier, the very thing about religious belief is that it is the acceptance of an extraordinarily incredible thing. And the whole point, much of the point, is that it can't be explained. It can't be rationalized. It can't be attributed to causes. It can't even be proven, save for the fact that, well, if it didn't happen, how would we be here? And it's complicated. And the other thing, just to round this up, is that religious folklore is often far more actually predicated on the sense of groupness than it is in a necessary binary, I believe, I do not believe in these stories. Because the narratives might give comfort. The narratives might give comfort to people as they accept it literally. And that's cool. The narratives might give comfort to people as they accept it metaphorically. And that's also cool. That this is not, I do not think that this actually purports how the universe is, But I like the way that this provides a structure for understanding. And what is more, this is the structure that my group has inherited. And I can take from it intelligently. I can move within it comfortably. And I do not, and it is when my group is gathered that the story is operative. And I do not necessarily need to have that story as operative once I leave my group, because it forces you. The study of religious folklore, the study of religious belief and how it's actually sort of manifested in particular circumstances, it forces you to push away from very limiting and ultimately boring binaries, where one is looking for utter and total consistency in worldview, because we do that for other people, despite the fact that we ourselves are complex and nuanced and contingent and change in a way that is not disingenuous, but change according to context, change who we are, change how we understand ourselves, because it is about our relationships with other people. It's a fascinating area. So, yeah, that's it. So be well. I've talked a lot longer than I thought I would, but you're getting used to that now. All right, my friends. Talk to you later. Be well.